The lightning split the sky over El Paso, Texas in jagged white veins, and Penelope Carson threw herself against the stable door as thunder crashed so close she felt it in her bones. Inside, 6 horses screamed and kicked against their stalls, wild-eyed with terror as the storm raged through the late summer night of 1878. She had been helping her father with the evening rounds when the tempest descended without warning, transforming the docile animals into creatures of pure panic. Her father had rushed to secure the other buildings on their property, leaving her alone with the frightened beasts whose hooves threatened to splinter wood and break their own legs in their desperation to escape. Penelope pressed her back against the rough timber wall, her heart hammering as she watched the chaos unfold. At 19 years old, she had grown up around horses her entire life, but she had never seen them this terrified. The storm seemed to possess a rage beyond anything natural, and the animals could sense something primal and dangerous in the electricity that charged the air. One of the mares reared up, her front hooves striking the stall door with such force that Penelope feared it would give way entirely. Blood pounded in her ears as she realized she had to do something before they hurt themselves or worse. Without thinking, without planning, she opened her mouth and began to sing. The melody came from somewhere deep inside her, a lullaby her mother had sung to her before the fever took her 3 years ago. The words floated through the stable like silk ribbons, soft and gentle, weaving between the thunder and the frightened whinnies. She sang of quiet meadows and gentle streams, of sunshine warming soft grass, of peace and safety and rest. Her voice trembled at first, barely audible over the storm, but she pushed through her fear and sang louder, clearer, letting the music fill every corner of the stable. The effect was not immediate, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the horses began to quiet. Their ears swiveled toward her voice, their eyes still rolling but the whites showing less. Penelope moved forward slowly, still singing, her hands outstretched but not touching, letting them see her and hear her and understand that she meant no harm. The big bay gelding in the nearest stall stopped pawing at the ground, his sides still heaving but his head lowering slightly. She sang verse after verse, making up words when the original lyrics ran out, keeping her tone soft and soothing, letting the rhythm of the melody override the chaos of the storm. She did not hear the stable door open behind her. She did not notice the tall figure that stepped inside, rain dripping from his hat brim, his coat soaked through. She was lost in the music, in the connection she was building with the frightened animals, in the desperate hope that her voice alone could keep them from destroying themselves. The horses were calming, their breathing slowing, their movements becoming less frantic. She sang about her mother's garden, about the roses that bloomed every spring, about the mockingbirds that nested in the cottonwood tree outside her bedroom window. Zachary Dawson stood perfectly still just inside the door, afraid that any movement would shatter the spell she was weaving. He had been riding hard through the storm, trying to reach El Paso before the worst of it hit, when his horse had balked at crossing the swollen creek on the edge of town. Rather than force the animal through the dangerous current, he had spotted the Carson place and hoped to beg shelter until the tempest passed. But when he approached the stable, he had heard something that stopped him in his tracks, a voice so pure and beautiful that for a moment he forgot about the rain soaking through his clothes and the thunder shaking the earth beneath his feet. He watched her move among the horses, her dark hair hanging loose down her back in a thick braid, her simple cotton dress muddy at the hem. She was not particularly tall, but she carried herself with a confidence that made her seem larger than her actual size. Her face was turned away from him, but he could see the curve of her cheek, the gentle movement of her lips as she sang. The horses were responding to her in a way he had never seen before, their fear visibly melting away under the influence of her voice. It was the most remarkable thing he had ever witnessed. When she finally fell silent, the storm still raged outside, but the stable had become an oasis of calm. The horses stood quietly in their stalls, occasionally shifting their weight or blowing softly through their nostrils, but the panic had left them entirely. Penelope let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders sagging with relief. She reached out to stroke the nose of the nearest horse, a gray mare with kind eyes, and whispered soft words of praise and comfort. That was when Zachary finally spoke, his voice low and rough from days on the trail. "Your voice brings peace everywhere." Penelope spun around, her hand flying to her chest, her eyes wide with surprise. She had not known anyone was watching, and the sudden appearance of a stranger in the dim light of the stable sent a jolt of alarm through her. But as her eyes adjusted and took in the man standing just inside the door, something in his posture and expression told her he meant no harm. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and mud-caked boots, his face shadowed by the brim of his wet hat. Water pooled around his feet, and she could see he was shivering slightly despite the warm night air. "I did not mean to startle you," he said quickly, removing his hat and revealing sandy brown hair and eyes the color of weathered wood. "I was seeking shelter from the storm and heard you singing. I have been around horses all my life, but I have never seen anything like what you just did. Those animals were about to tear themselves apart, and you calmed them with nothing but your voice." Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks, unused to such direct praise from a stranger. "They just needed to be reminded that they were safe," she said softly. "Fear makes us all forget what we know to be true." Zachary nodded slowly, studying her face in the lantern light. She was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 19 or 20, with delicate features and eyes the color of spring grass. There was something in the way she held herself, a quiet strength that spoke of hardship endured and overcome. He found himself wanting to know her story, to understand what had shaped her into someone who could sing lullabies to frightened horses in the middle of a raging storm. "My name is Zachary Dawson," he said, taking a step forward but careful not to crowd her. "I have been riding for 3 days from Fort Worth, trying to reach El Paso before my funds run out completely. My horse refused to cross the creek back there, and I saw your light. I was hoping to ask permission to wait out the storm in your stable, if that would not be too much of an imposition." Penelope considered him carefully, weighing the potential danger against the obvious need. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and no decent person would send a traveler back out into such weather. Besides, something in his eyes spoke of honesty and integrity, qualities her father had taught her to recognize in men. "You can stay until the storm passes," she said finally. "But my father will be here shortly, and if he decides otherwise, you will have to respect his wishes." "Of course," Zachary agreed immediately. "I am grateful for whatever shelter you can provide, and I will be on my way as soon as the weather clears." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the rain hammering on the roof above them, the horses shuffling peacefully in their stalls. Penelope busied herself checking each animal, running her hands over their legs to ensure no damage had been done during their panic, murmuring soft words of encouragement. Zachary found a relatively dry corner near the door and settled himself on a hay bale, trying not to stare but finding his eyes drawn to her again and again. There was something about her that fascinated him beyond her obvious beauty and remarkable way with animals. She moved with a grace that suggested a gentle spirit, but there was also a hardness around her eyes, a wariness that spoke of pain experienced too young. He wondered what had put that shadow in her expression, what losses she had endured in her short life. He found himself wanting to ease that sadness, to make her smile, though he had no right to such thoughts about a woman he had just met. The stable door burst open suddenly, and a stocky man in his 50s rushed in, his face red from exertion and worry. "Penelope, thank God, are you all right?" I heard the horses screaming from clear across the yard, and I thought. He stopped short when he saw Zachary rising to his feet, his expression immediately shifting to suspicion and protective anger. "Who are you? What are you doing in my stable?" "Pa, it is all right," Penelope said quickly, moving to stand between them. "This is Zachary Dawson. He arrived just as I finished calming the horses and asked permission to shelter from the storm. I told him he could stay until the weather clears if you approve." Richard Carson looked from his daughter to the stranger and back again, his jaw tight with concern. He was fiercely protective of Penelope, especially since losing his wife, and the thought of her alone in the stable with a strange man made his blood run cold. But as he studied the young man more carefully, taking in his respectful posture and honest eyes, he felt some of his initial alarm subside. Besides, Penelope had always had good instincts about people, and if she felt comfortable enough to grant him temporary shelter, he would trust her judgment. "You can stay," Richard said gruffly, "but you will keep your distance from my daughter and you will be gone as soon as the rain stops." "Understood?" "Yes, sir," Zachary replied immediately. "I appreciate your hospitality, and I give you my word as a gentleman that your daughter is perfectly safe in my presence." Richard grunted, still not entirely convinced but willing to give the stranger the benefit of the doubt. He turned to Penelope, his expression softening. "The horses seem calm now. How did you manage it?" "I sang to them," Penelope said simply. "Like Mama used to sing to me when I was frightened." Richard's eyes grew distant for a moment, memory washing over him. His wife had possessed the most beautiful voice, clear and pure as a mountain stream, and their daughter had inherited that gift. He remembered countless nights when Sarah would sing their baby girl to sleep, her lullabies floating through the small house like prayers. He swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in his throat and nodded. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said quietly. "You have her gift." The three of them settled into an uneasy coexistence as the storm continued its assault on the world outside. Richard busied himself with final checks on the horses, while Penelope found a dry blanket for Zachary and pointed out where he could find water for himself, and his mount once the animal was brought in from wherever he had left it tied. Zachary insisted his horse was safely sheltered under an overhang near the creek and would be fine until morning, not wanting to impose any further on their hospitality. As the night wore on, and the storm showed no signs of weakening, they found themselves drawn into conversation despite the initial awkwardness. Zachary explained that he was a ranch hand by trade, drifting from place to place seeking work, and had heard that several of the larger spreads outside El Paso were hiring for the fall roundup. Richard admitted that his own small operation was struggling, that the past few years had been hard on independent ranchers, with larger outfits buying up land and water rights, squeezing out the smaller operations. Penelope listened more than she spoke, but when she did offer her thoughts, both men found themselves paying close attention. She had a sharp mind and a practical nature, suggesting solutions to problems her father raised that he had not considered. Zachary found himself increasingly impressed by her, not just by her beauty or her gift with animals, but by her intelligence and quiet strength. She was unlike any woman he had met in his travels, and he felt something stirring in his chest that he had not experienced in a very long time. The storm finally began to break around midnight, the thunder growing more distant, the rain easing to a steady drizzle. Richard announced he was heading back to the house and expected Penelope to come with him, casting a meaningful look at Zachary that clearly communicated his expectations regarding appropriate behavior. Penelope bid Zachary a polite goodnight and followed her father into the darkness, leaving the cowboy alone with his thoughts and the now peaceful horses. Zachary lay back on the hay bale, his mind too active for sleep, despite his exhaustion. He kept seeing her face in his mind's eye, hearing her voice singing those lullabies, remembering the way the horses had responded to her gentle touch. He had traveled through half of Texas and parts of New Mexico, worked on a dozen different ranches, met hundreds of people, but none of them had affected him the way this young woman had in just a few short hours. He told himself he was being foolish, that he would be moving on in the morning and would likely never see her again, but the thought filled him with an unexpected sadness. In the small house across the yard, Penelope was having similar thoughts as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the rain on the roof gradually fade to nothing. She kept thinking about the stranger in their stable, about his kind eyes and respectful manner, about the way he had watched her with such obvious admiration. Most men in town treated her with either indifference or the sort of crude attention that made her skin crawl. But Zachary Dawson had looked at her like she was something precious and rare. The memory made her heart beat faster, and she pressed her hand against her chest, confused by the intensity of her reaction to someone she had only just met. Morning came bright and clear, the storm having washed the air clean and left everything smelling fresh and new. Zachary woke early, as was his habit, and tended to the horses, mucking out stalls and refilling water troughs as a small gesture of thanks for the shelter he had received. He was finishing up when Penelope appeared in the doorway, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She seemed surprised to find him working, and a smile touched her lips, lighting up her whole face in a way that made his heart skip. "You did not have to do that," she said, setting the basket on a bench near the door. "But I thank you. Pa will appreciate it." "It is the least I could do," Zachary replied, leaning the pitchfork against the wall. "You and your father showed me kindness when you did not have to. I wanted to repay that in some small way." Penelope lifted the cloth from the basket, revealing fresh biscuits, bacon, and eggs still warm from the skillet. "I brought you breakfast," she said. "I figured you would be heading out soon and might appreciate a hot meal before you go." Zachary felt his throat tighten with gratitude. It had been weeks since anyone had shown him such simple kindness, and coming from her, it meant more than she could possibly know. "That is very generous of you," he managed, moving closer. "Would you sit with me while I eat? I would welcome the company if you have the time." Penelope hesitated, knowing her father would disapprove, but something in her wanted to stay, to learn more about this stranger who had appeared in their stable like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. She settled herself on the bench, smoothing her skirt over her knees, and watched as Zachary dug into the food with obvious appreciation. They talked easily, the conversation flowing naturally from topic to topic. He told her about the places he had been, the things he had seen, the hard lessons he had learned about life and people and survival in a harsh land. Penelope found herself opening up in ways she rarely did, telling him about her mother's death, about how hard it had been to watch the fever consume her, about the emptiness that still lingered in their house 3 years later. She spoke of her dreams of maybe becoming a teacher someday, of wanting to make a difference in people's lives the way her mother had made a difference in hers. Zachary listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was truly paying attention, not just waiting for his turn to talk. "You should pursue that dream," he said seriously when she finished. "You have a gift for bringing peace and understanding, not just to animals but to people too. I can see it in the way you carry yourself, in the way you speak. You would make an excellent teacher." Penelope felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. No one had ever encouraged her dreams before, had ever suggested they were anything more than foolish fantasies. Her father loved her but was practical to a fault, always steering conversations toward immediate needs and responsibilities rather than distant possibilities. But this stranger, this man she had known for less than a day, seemed to understand something essential about her, something she had barely understood about herself. They might have sat there talking all morning if Richard had not appeared, his expression stern as he took in the domestic scene. "I thought you would be on your way by now, Dawson," he said bluntly. "The storm has passed and you said you had business in El Paso." Zachary stood immediately, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. "You are right, of course. I should get moving." He turned to Penelope, holding her gaze for a long moment. "Thank you for everything. I will not forget your kindness." "Safe travels," Penelope said softly, feeling an unexpected pang of loss as she watched him gather his few possessions and head for the door. He tipped his hat to both of them and disappeared into the morning sunshine, leaving her with a strange emptiness in her chest. Richard watched his daughter's face carefully, noting the wistfulness in her expression, the way her eyes lingered on the empty doorway. "Do not go getting ideas, Penny," he said gently. "Men like that, drifters with no roots, they are not the settling kind. He will be gone from El Paso in a week or two, and you will never see him again." "I know, Pa," Penelope replied, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. She busied herself collecting the empty basket and dishes, not wanting her father to see the tears that threatened to spill over. She was being ridiculous, she told herself firmly. She had known Zachary Dawson for a handful of hours, had no claim on him, no reason to feel this sense of loss. But the heart did not always listen to reason, and hers was aching in a way it never had before. The following days passed in their usual rhythm, but Penelope found her thoughts constantly drifting back to the stranger who had sheltered in their stable. She wondered if he had found work, if he was still in El Paso, or if he had moved on to greener pastures. She caught herself scanning the faces of every man who passed their property, hoping irrationally to see those weathered wood eyes and sandy brown hair. She tried to focus on her chores, on helping her father with the endless work that came with maintaining even a small ranch. But everything felt flat and colorless compared to those few hours of conversation and connection. Zachary, meanwhile, had indeed found work at one of the larger ranches outside town, a sprawling operation owned by a man named Samuel Hartford, who ran cattle across several thousand acres of scrubland. The work was hard and the pay modest, but it was steady employment, and Zachary threw himself into it with determined focus. He told himself he needed to save money, to build up enough of a stake that he could maybe start thinking about settling down somewhere permanently instead of drifting from place to place like tumbleweed. But if he was being honest with himself, the real reason he stayed in El Paso was the hope that he might see Penelope Carson again. He thought about her constantly, about her voice singing lullabies in the storm, about her gentle way with the frightened horses, about the intelligence and warmth in her green eyes. He had met beautiful women before, had even fancied himself in love once or twice, but this was different. This felt like something deeper, something that reached into his chest and wrapped around his heart like a vine. 3 weeks after their first meeting, fate gave him the excuse he needed. One of the Hartford ranch horses developed a terrible anxiety, spooked by something in the night, and refusing to be approached by anyone without rearing and kicking. Samuel Hartford was ready to put the animal down, declaring it too dangerous and unpredictable to be worth the trouble. But Zachary found himself thinking about Penelope and her gift for calming frightened creatures. "I know someone who might be able to help," he said before he could talk himself out of it. "A woman in town who has a way with horses. She calmed 6 panicked animals during that big storm a few weeks back, just by singing to them. If anyone can reach this one, it would be her." Hartford was skeptical but agreed to let Zachary try, figuring they had nothing to lose since the horse was headed for a bullet anyway. Zachary saddled up immediately and rode into El Paso, his heart pounding with an excitement he had not felt since he was a boy on Christmas morning. He knew he was using the spooked horse as an excuse, knew that his real motivation was simply the overwhelming desire to see Penelope again. But he pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the legitimate problem at hand. He found the Carson place easily, the small ranch looking even more run down in the harsh afternoon light than it had during the storm. He noted the sagging fence posts, the barn that desperately needed new shingles, the general air of genteel poverty that hung over everything. Richard Carson was working in the corral, and his expression turned guarded when he recognized Zachary riding up the dusty path. "What brings you back here, Dawson?" Richard asked, his tone not quite hostile but certainly not welcoming either. "I need your daughter's help," Zachary said bluntly, figuring honesty was the best approach. "We have a horse at the Hartford ranch that has gone wild with fear, and the boss is planning to put it down." I remembered what Penelope did during the storm, and I thought maybe she could work the same magic with this animal. I would be willing to pay for her time, of course. Richard's eyebrows rose in surprise. He had not expected that, had assumed the young cowboy was sniffing around his daughter for less honorable reasons. The offer of payment was tempting. God knew they needed the money, but he was also wary of putting Penelope in a potentially dangerous situation with a spooked horse. "How bad is the animal?" he asked cautiously. "Bad enough that Hartford wants it dead," Zachary admitted, "but I have seen it, and I think it is more frightened than truly aggressive. I think Penelope could reach it if she is willing to try." Before Richard could respond, Penelope appeared from the house, clearly having heard their conversation from the open window. Her face lit up when she saw Zachary, a reaction she tried to hide but not quickly enough to escape her father's notice. "I will do it," she said firmly. "If there is a chance I can save that horse, I have to try." Richard wanted to argue, wanted to protect his daughter from potential danger and from the young man who had clearly captured her interest. But he saw the determination in her eyes and knew there was no point in fighting. Penelope had her mother's stubborn streak, and once she set her mind to something, she was as immovable as a mountain. "Fine," he said with a sigh, "but I am coming with you, and at the first sign of real danger we are walking away. Understood?" "Understood," Penelope agreed quickly, already heading back into the house to grab her bonnet and a shawl. Her heart was racing, partly from excitement at the challenge ahead, but mostly from the simple fact that she was going to spend more time with Zachary Dawson. She had tried so hard to forget him, to push thoughts of him out of her mind, but seeing him again brought all those feelings rushing back with startling intensity. The ride to the Hartford ranch took about an hour, and Penelope spent most of it listening to Zachary describe the spooked horse and what he had observed of its behavior. He rode close beside her, their horses almost touching, and she was acutely aware of his presence, of the way his hands held the reins with confident ease, of the way his eyes kept flicking over to her as if to reassure himself she was really there. Her father rode slightly ahead, giving them space but clearly listening to every word. When they arrived at the ranch, Samuel Hartford himself came out to meet them, his weathered face skeptical as he took in Penelope's small frame and youth. "This is your miracle worker, Dawson. She is just a girl." "She is young, but she has a gift," Zachary said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "At least let her try before you condemn that animal to death." Hartford shrugged, clearly unconvinced but willing to humor his employee. "The horse is in the far corral. We have been keeping it isolated since it went crazy 3 days ago. Be careful, miss. I would hate to see you get hurt." Penelope nodded and followed Zachary to the corral, her father close on her heels. The horse was indeed in a bad state. A beautiful chestnut mare with a white blaze, pacing frantically along the fence line, her coat dark with sweat, and her eyes rolling with terror. Penelope's heart went out to the creature immediately, recognizing the depth of her fear and the pain that must be driving such extreme behavior. "What happened to her?" Penelope asked, studying the mare's movements carefully. "No one knows for sure," Zachary replied. "She was fine one day, and the next morning we found her like this. Hartford thinks maybe a snake got into her stall, or possibly a mountain lion passed too close in the night. Whatever it was, it scared her half to death, and she has not let anyone near her since." Penelope nodded slowly, her mind already working on the problem. She had dealt with frightened horses before, but never one quite this far gone. She would need to be patient, to move slowly, to let the mare set the pace. Most importantly, she would need to find that place inside herself where the music lived, that wellspring of calm and peace that had served her so well during the storm. She approached the corral fence slowly, making no sudden movements, keeping her body language relaxed and non-threatening. The mare immediately stopped pacing and swung her head toward Penelope, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, woman and horse, each taking the measure of the other. Then Penelope opened her mouth and began to sing. The melody was different from the lullabies she had sung during the storm, something slower and more mournful, a song her mother had loved about a lost love and longing for home. The words drifted across the corral like smoke, soft and gentle, carrying with them an ache of understanding and compassion. Penelope sang about fear and pain, about the darkness that sometimes swallowed us whole, about the desperate need for safety and comfort when the world became too much to bear. The mare's ears swiveled forward, her head lifting slightly, confusion replacing some of the wild panic in her eyes. Penelope kept singing, kept pouring everything she had into the music, letting her voice become a bridge between the human world and the animal one. She sang verse after verse, her eyes never leaving the mare's face, her hands resting lightly on the fence rail, making no move to enter the corral or approach any closer. Behind her, Zachary watched with his heart in his throat, mesmerized all over again by what she could do with just her voice. He had brought her here hoping she could help the mare, but seeing it actually happen, watching the visible transformation as the horse gradually relaxed under the influence of Penelope's singing, was nothing short of miraculous. He glanced over at Richard Carson and saw his own wonder reflected in the older man's face. After what might have been 10 minutes or might have been an hour, time losing all meaning in the magic of the moment, Penelope finally fell silent. The mare stood quietly now, her sides still heaving but her panic visibly diminished. Penelope waited a few more moments, then slowly, carefully, climbed over the fence and dropped into the corral. Her father made a noise of alarm, but Zachary put a hand on his arm, stopping him from interfering. Penelope moved like water, flowing rather than walking, every gesture smooth and unthreatening. She kept up a steady stream of soft words, not quite singing now but letting her voice maintain that soothing quality. The mare watched her approach, trembling but not bolting, clearly torn between the urge to flee and a desperate need for comfort. When Penelope was close enough to touch, she stopped and simply stood there, waiting, letting the horse make the final decision. After a long, breathless moment, the mare stretched her neck forward and snuffed at Penelope's outstretched hand. Penelope remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as the horse explored her scent and decided she was safe. Then, like a miracle, the mare took a step closer and rested her head against Penelope's shoulder, a long, shuddering sigh escaping her as if a great burden had been lifted. Penelope wrapped her arms around the mare's neck, continuing to murmur soft reassurances, her hands stroking the sweaty coat with gentle confidence. She could feel the horse's heart beating against her own, could sense the gradual easing of tension as trust began to replace fear. They stood like that for a long time, girl and horse finding comfort in each other. Two creatures who understood what it meant to be afraid and alone in a harsh world. When Penelope finally led the mare out of the corral and toward the stable, walking beside her like an old friend rather than a wild animal that had been moments from death, Samuel Hartford could only shake his head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like that in 40 years of working with horses," he said gruffly. That mare was finished, and she brought her back from the edge with nothing but her voice and some gentle handling. "I told you she was special," Zachary said quietly, unable to keep the pride from his voice. Hartford turned to Richard, pulling out his wallet. "Name your price for your daughter's services. That horse is worth a lot of money, and she just saved me from losing the investment entirely." Richard started to name a modest figure, but Penelope surprised them all by speaking up herself. "I do not want money, Mr. Hartford, but I would like to come back and work with your mare for a few more days, to make sure she is truly settled and not just temporarily calm. In exchange, perhaps you could throw some work my father's way. I know you have more cattle than you can comfortably manage, and our ranch is small, but we run a tight operation. A contract for even 100 head would make a real difference to us." Hartford studied her thoughtfully, reassessing his initial judgment. This was no simpering girl, but a young woman with a sharp business mind and the courage to negotiate on her family's behalf. He liked that, respected it. "You have yourself a deal, miss. I will send 200 head your way, along with payment for feed and management. And you can come back here as often as you like to work with the mare. In fact, if you would be interested, I could use someone with your skills on a more permanent basis. I have 30 horses on this ranch, and they all need training and care." Penelope's eyes widened at the offer, her mind racing with possibilities. A regular position at the Hartford ranch would mean steady income, would mean she could help her father save their property, would mean she could start building toward a future instead of just surviving day to day. But it would also mean seeing Zachary Dawson on a regular basis, and she was not sure if that was a blessing or a complication she was not ready to handle. "Can I think about it?" she asked carefully. "Take all the time you need," Hartford replied. "The offer stands whenever you are ready." The ride back to the Carson place was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Richard was processing the unexpected turn of events, pleased by the cattle contract but wary of his daughter spending so much time at the Hartford ranch, where Zachary Dawson worked. Penelope was wrestling with her own conflicted feelings, excited by the opportunity but nervous about what it might mean for her carefully guarded heart. And Zachary was simply trying to figure out how to convince Penelope to take the job without revealing just how desperately he wanted her nearby. When they reached the Carson property, Richard went inside to start dinner, leaving Zachary and Penelope alone in the fading light of evening. They stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite sure what to say, the air thick with unspoken words and unexpressed feelings. "You were amazing today," Zachary finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "The way you reached that mare, the way you brought her back from the edge, it was the most incredible thing I have ever seen." "I just did what felt right," Penelope replied, looking down at her hands. "Animals are not so different from people. We all need to know that someone cares, that someone sees our pain and wants to help ease it. You have a gift, Penelope. A real gift. You should take Hartford's offer. You could do real good there, help a lot of animals, and the money would help your father too. Is that the only reason you think I should take it?" The question came out before she could stop it, her eyes lifting to meet his, challenging and vulnerable all at once. Zachary felt his breath catch in his throat. This was the moment, he realized. This was when he either stepped forward and took a risk or stepped back and let her slip away forever. The smart thing would be to step back, to protect himself from the possibility of rejection and heartache. But looking into those green eyes, seeing the hope and fear swirling in their depths, he found he could not be smart. He could only be honest. "No," he said simply. "That is not the only reason. The truth is, I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the night of the storm. I know we barely know each other. I know I have no right to feel this way, but I cannot help it. You have gotten under my skin, Penelope Carson, and I do not want you to disappear from my life before I have had a chance to really know you." Penelope felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, relief and joy flooding through her in equal measure. She had been so afraid that the connection she felt was one-sided, that she was reading too much into simple kindness. But hearing him say the words out loud, seeing the raw honesty in his face, made her feel like she could finally breathe again after weeks of holding her breath. "I have been thinking about you too," she admitted softly. "Every day. I kept telling myself I was being foolish, that you were just passing through and I should not let myself care, but it did not matter. My heart did not listen to my head." Zachary took a step closer, then another, until they were standing so close he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair. "If you take Hartford's job, we could see each other every day. We could take the time to really get to know one another to see if this thing between us is as real as it feels. I am not asking for promises or commitments right now. I am just asking for a chance." "A chance," Penelope repeated, the word tasting like hope on her tongue. "I can do that." They stood there in the gathering dusk, not quite touching but close enough to feel the warmth radiating between them. And for the first time in 3 years, Penelope felt something other than grief and worry. She felt alive, felt possibility opening up before her like a flower unfurling its petals to the sun. Whatever came next, whatever challenges and complications lay ahead, she knew this moment was one she would remember forever. The next morning, Penelope rode back to the Hartford ranch with her father's reluctant blessing and her own heart beating triple time with anticipation. Samuel Hartford greeted her warmly and immediately set her to work assessing his stock and developing training plans for the younger horses. Zachary appeared a few minutes later, ostensibly to help with whatever she needed, but really just wanting to be near her. They worked side by side throughout the day, their conversation flowing easily as they moved from horse to horse, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked, each touch sending sparks up Penelope's arm. Over the following weeks, they fell into a comfortable routine. Penelope would arrive at the ranch each morning, and she and Zachary would spend the day working with the horses, breaking for lunch under the shade of a sprawling mesquite tree, their talks ranging from serious discussions about their pasts and their dreams to light-hearted banter that left them both laughing. Slowly, carefully, They built a friendship that formed the foundation for something deeper. Zachary told her about his childhood in Arkansas, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 14, about the years he spent drifting from place to place trying to find somewhere he belonged. Penelope shared her own stories of loss and loneliness, of the terrible months watching her mother fade away, of the struggle to keep her father from sinking into despair afterward. They discovered they had both been shaped by grief, but had chosen very different ways of coping with it. Zachary had run from his pain, constantly moving so he never had to face it. Penelope had planted her feet and held on, refusing to let loss define her even as it changed her forever. "I think I have been running long enough," Zachary said one afternoon as they sat by the creek that ran through the Hartford property, their boots off and their feet dangling in the cool water. "I think maybe it is time to stop and build something real, something lasting." "What would you build?" Penelope asked, turning to look at him, her heart in her throat because she thought she knew where this was leading but was afraid to assume. "A life," Zachary said simply. "A home. A family eventually. All the things I thought I did not want or deserve because I was too afraid to let myself want them. But you have made me rethink everything, Penelope. You have made me believe that maybe I could have those things after all, if I was brave enough to reach for them." "I think you are plenty brave," Penelope said softly. "You crossed a flooded creek in a storm to seek shelter. You stood up to your boss to save a horse you barely knew. You opened your heart to me even though I know it scared you. That is the definition of courage." Zachary reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "Will you take a walk with me tonight, after work? There is something I want to ask you and I want to do it properly." Penelope's breath caught, her pulse suddenly racing. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and squeezed his hand in return. They sat there in comfortable silence for a while longer, the water burbling over stones, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, the future stretching out before them full of possibility and promise. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Zachary met Penelope outside the Hartford ranch house. He had spent the afternoon in a state of nervous anticipation, rehearsing what he wanted to say, worrying about whether it was too soon, whether she would think him presumptuous. But every time doubt crept in, he thought about the way she looked at him, the way she laughed at his jokes, the way her hand felt in his, and he knew he was making the right choice. They walked in silence for a while, following a path that led up a small rise overlooking the ranch and the town of El Paso beyond. The evening air was starting to cool, and Penelope had brought a shawl which she wrapped around her shoulders. When they reached the top of the rise, Zachary stopped and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I have been thinking about what I want to say to you all day," he began, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "I practiced speeches in my head, tried to come up with pretty words that would do justice to what I feel. But now that we are here, all those carefully planned words have flown right out of my mind, and I am left with just the simple truth." He paused, taking a deep breath, his eyes searching her face in the fading light. "Penelope Carson, I am falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since the first moment I heard you singing in that stable. Maybe it took a little longer, but either way, here I am, completely lost to you. I know we have only known each other a couple of months. I know this is fast, maybe too fast by conventional standards. But I have spent enough years of my life being cautious and holding back, and I do not want to do that anymore. Not with you." Penelope felt tears begin to slide down her cheeks, but they were happy tears, tears of relief and joy and overwhelming emotion. She had been hoping for this, dreaming of it, but actually hearing him say the words was more powerful than she could have imagined. I am not asking you to marry me, Zachary continued quickly, mistaking her tears for distress. Not yet, anyway, though I hope someday you might consider it. Right now, I am just asking if you feel the same way, if there is a chance that what I feel is not one-sided. If you think you could maybe love me back given enough time. Time, Penelope laughed through her tears, a sound of pure happiness. Zachary Dawson, I do not need more time. I have been in love with you for weeks now, maybe since that very first night when you stood in our stable and told me my voice brought peace. I tried to fight it, tried to convince myself I was being foolish, but my heart knew the truth even when my head tried to deny it. Zachary felt like someone had just lifted a weight off his chest that he had been carrying for years. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Penelope melted into the embrace, her face pressed against his chest, listening to the rapid beating of his heart that matched her own. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the sun sink below the horizon and the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "So what happens now?" Penelope asked eventually, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Now we take things one day at a time," Zachary replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We keep getting to know each other. We let this thing between us grow naturally without rushing it. And when the time is right, when we both know we are ready, I will ask you properly to be my wife, and hopefully you will say yes." "I will say yes," Penelope said with absolute certainty. "Whenever you ask, the answer will be yes." They walked back down the rise hand in hand, their future not yet fully formed but the foundation solidly in place. When Zachary delivered her back to her father's ranch that evening, Richard took one look at their joined hands and their radiant faces and knew exactly what had transpired. He felt the protective instinct rise up in him, the urge to challenge Zachary and make sure his intentions were honorable, but looking at the happiness in his daughter's eyes, he found he could not bring himself to dampen her joy. "You will be good to her," he said to Zachary, not quite a question but not quite a statement either. "I will spend every day of my life making her happy," Zachary replied, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. "You have my word on that." Richard nodded slowly, then surprised them both by extending his hand. "Then you have my blessing, for whatever that is worth. Lord knows she has been through enough sadness in her young life. She deserves some happiness." The months that followed were the sweetest Penelope had ever known. She and Zachary spent nearly every day together, working with the Hartford horses, taking long walks in the evening, talking about everything and nothing, building a relationship based on friendship and trust as much as romance and passion. Zachary proved himself to be everything Penelope had hoped for and more, kind and patient, funny and thoughtful. Someone who truly listened when she spoke and valued her opinions and ideas. He surprised her with small gifts, wildflowers he picked on his rides, a ribboned bookmark when he learned she loved to read, a beautiful comb for her hair carved from light wood. Penelope reciprocated with her own gestures of affection, mending his worn shirts, packing extra food in his lunch pail, singing softly while they worked together. They navigated the awkwardness of physical affection slowly, progressing from held hands to stolen kisses to longer embraces, always mindful of propriety, but unable to completely resist the pull they felt toward each other. Samuel Hartford watched their courtship with approval, pleased to see his reliable ranch hand settling down, and even more pleased to have Penelope's continued presence on his property. Under her care, his horses had become noticeably calmer and better trained, and word was beginning to spread throughout the area about the young woman who could work miracles with difficult animals. Several other ranchers had approached Hartford about borrowing Penelope's services, and he had negotiated deals that benefited everyone involved, taking a small percentage while ensuring Penelope and her father received fair compensation. The Carson ranch began to recover financially, the cattle contract and Penelope's earnings allowing them to make much-needed repairs and even hire a part-time hand to help with the heavy work. Richard watched his daughter bloom under the influence of steady income and steady love, and found himself grateful to the young drifter who had appeared in their stable that stormy night. Zachary had kept every promise he made, treating Penelope with respect and devotion, and Richard could no longer deny that the cowboy was good for his daughter. As summer faded into fall and fall gave way to winter, Zachary felt increasingly certain that he had found where he belonged. El Paso might not be the most glamorous town, and the work was still hard and the pay still modest, but none of that mattered because he had Penelope. She had become the center of his world, the person he thought about first thing in the morning and last thing at night, the one who made every day brighter just by existing. Christmas came, and Zachary spent the day with Penelope and Richard, the three of them sharing a simple meal and exchanging modest gifts. Zachary gave Penelope a lovely silver locket that had cost him nearly a month's wages, and she gave him a leather journal for recording his thoughts and experiences, something he had mentioned wanting but never getting around to buying. They sat close together by the fire that evening, Penelope's head resting on Zachary's shoulder, and he knew with absolute certainty that this was the moment he had been waiting for. After Richard excused himself to bed, Zachary turned to Penelope, taking her hands in his. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I have something I need to ask you, and I cannot wait any longer." Penelope's breath caught, her eyes widening as she realized what was coming. "Zachary." He slid off the chair and dropped to one knee, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. It was not elaborate or expensive, but it was honest and true, just like his feelings. "Penelope Carson, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and making you happy? Will you build a future with me, have a family with me, grow old with me? I know I am not rich, and I cannot promise you an easy life, but I can promise that I will love you with everything I have, every single day, for as long as I live." Tears were streaming down Penelope's face, her hands trembling in his. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, of course yes." Zachary slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and passion he had been holding back for months. Penelope kissed him back just as fervently, her hands tangling in his hair, her heart soaring with pure joy. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she laughed and cried at the same time, overwhelmed by the intensity of her happiness. "I love you," she said, cupping his face in her hands. "I love you so much, Zachary Dawson." "I love you too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." They set their wedding for early spring, wanting to give themselves time to prepare, but not wanting to wait too long. Penelope threw herself into the planning with enthusiasm, sewing her own dress with help from some of the women in town, arranging for a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of El Paso. Zachary worked extra hours and took on side jobs, determined to save enough money to make a real start on their life together. Samuel Hartford, learning of their engagement, made them an unexpected offer. He had a small house on the far edge of his property that had stood empty for years, and he proposed that Zachary and Penelope could live there rent-free in exchange for Penelope continuing to work with his horses, and Zachary serving as a sort of informal foreman for the ranch hands. It was more responsibility but also a real opportunity, and they accepted gratefully, seeing it as the first step toward building something of their own. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the Texas sky a brilliant blue, the spring wildflowers blooming in profusion across the scrubland. Penelope wore her mother's pearls with her simple white dress, and Zachary stood at the altar in his best suit, his hands shaking slightly as he watched her walk down the aisle on her father's arm. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he sent up a silent prayer of thanks that she had chosen him. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken with voices thick with emotion, their hands clasped tight as if afraid to let go. When the preacher finally pronounced them husband and wife and told Zachary he could kiss his bride, he did so with tender passion, pouring every ounce of love he possessed into that single kiss. The small gathering of friends and neighbors erupted in applause, and Penelope laughed against his lips, joy radiating from every part of her. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful, with music and dancing and good food provided by the whole community. Penelope danced with her father, tears in both their eyes as Richard told her how proud her mother would have been to see this day. Zachary danced with his new bride until his feet ached, unwilling to let her out of his arms for more than a few moments, wanting to memorize every detail of this perfect day. As evening fell and the guests began to depart, Zachary and Penelope climbed into the wagon he had borrowed and rode out to their new home. The little house was nothing fancy, just 3 rooms and a covered porch, but Penelope had been working on it for weeks, cleaning and decorating, making it warm and welcoming. Someone had left flowers on the table, and a pie cooling on the windowsill, small gestures of community support that made Penelope's throat tight with gratitude. Zachary carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the awkwardness of it, then set her down gently in the middle of their small parlor. They stood there for a moment, suddenly shy despite everything they had shared, the weight of this new beginning pressing down on them. Then Penelope smiled and took his hand, leading him toward the bedroom, and the shyness melted away in the heat of their love and desire for each other. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a physical expression of everything they felt but could not quite put into words. Zachary was gentle and patient, mindful that this was new territory for both of them, making sure Penelope felt safe and loved every step of the way. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, her head on his chest, his arms wrapped around her, both of them marveling at the miracle of having found each other in a world that could be so harsh and unforgiving. "I never thought I could be this happy," Penelope whispered into the darkness. "I never imagined that life could feel this good." "Neither did I," Zachary replied, kissing her forehead. "But we are going to make sure it stays this way. We are going to build a good life together, Penelope. A life full of love and laughter and all the things that matter. Tell me what you see when you imagine our future," she said, tracing idle patterns on his chest. Zachary was quiet for a moment, letting himself really think about it. "I see children," he said finally. 2 or 3 at least. I see you singing to them the way you sing to the horses, lullabies that make them feel safe and loved. I see us growing old together, sitting on that porch out there watching the sunset, holding hands the way we do now. I see a life that is simple but rich, full of the things that really matter. Love, family, purpose, that is what I see." "I see the same thing," Penelope said softly. "Every bit of it." They drifted off to sleep wrapped in each other's arms, their hearts full, their future bright with promise. The first year of marriage was an adjustment, as it always is, but Zachary and Penelope navigated the challenges with patience and humor. They learned each other's habits and quirks, figured out how to compromise when they disagreed, discovered the rhythms of living as a partnership rather than as individuals. There were moments of frustration and misunderstanding, times when the stress of work or money or simply life got the better of them. But they always came back to the foundation of love and respect they had built, always remembered why they had chosen each other in the first place. Penelope continued her work with the Hartford horses, her reputation growing steadily throughout the region. She developed techniques for training difficult animals that other ranchers began to adopt, and she was increasingly sought after as a consultant and teacher. Zachary took on more responsibility at the ranch, proving himself to be a natural leader, someone the other hands respected and would follow without question. Samuel Hartford came to rely on him more and more, and began to talk about making Zachary a partner in the operation someday, a possibility that seemed almost too good to be true. In the spring of 1880, just over a year after their wedding, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. She told Zachary one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, the words tumbling out in a rush of nervous excitement. Zachary's reaction was everything she could have hoped for and more, his face lighting up with pure joy, his hands immediately going to her still flat belly as if he could somehow feel the life growing inside her. "We are going to be parents," he said wonderingly. "I am going to be a father." "You are going to be the best father," Penelope assured him, covering his hands with her own. "This baby is so lucky to have you." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Penelope suffered from terrible nausea in the early months and found herself exhausted by even simple tasks. Zachary hovered over her constantly, driving her crazy with his well-meaning concern, but also making her feel cherished and protected. As her belly grew, he took over more and more of her physical work with the horses, insisting she rest and take care of herself and their growing child. Richard Carson visited frequently, his excitement at becoming a grandfather palpable despite his attempts to remain gruff and practical. He built a beautiful cradle from oak wood, carving it with intricate designs of horses and flowers, a labor of love that brought tears to Penelope's eyes when he presented it to them. The community rallied around them as well, with the women hosting a baby shower and presenting Penelope with tiny clothes and blankets, and all manner of useful items for the baby's arrival. In November of 1880, as the first cold winds of winter began to blow across the Texas plains, Penelope went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when Zachary thought he might lose his mind from worry and helplessness. But the midwife who attended them was experienced and calm, and Penelope was stronger than anyone gave her credit for. And finally, just as dawn was breaking, a baby's cry pierced the air. "You have a son," the midwife announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a soft blanket and placing him in Penelope's arms. Penelope looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect, and felt her heart expand in her chest until she thought it might burst. Zachary knelt beside the bed, staring at their son with an expression of awe and terror and overwhelming love. He reached out one trembling finger and touched the baby's tiny hand, marveling when little fingers immediately curled around his own. "Hello, little one," Penelope whispered, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "We have been waiting so long to meet you." They named him Thomas after Zachary's father, and from the moment he entered the world, he became the center of their universe. Thomas was a good baby, generally happy and healthy, though he had his moments of fussiness like any infant. Penelope sang to him constantly, the lullabies and songs that had calmed frightened horses now soothing her son to sleep. Zachary proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor at night, marveling at every tiny milestone and development. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, his personality began to emerge. He was curious and adventurous, always getting into things he should not, keeping his parents constantly on their toes. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's sandy hair, and he possessed a charm that wrapped everyone around his tiny finger. Richard Carson doted on his grandson, teaching him about horses and the land, spending hours playing simple games and reading simple stories. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the next few years. Zachary continued to advance at the Hartford Ranch, eventually becoming a full partner, as Samuel had promised. Penelope scaled back her horse training work, while Thomas was young but never gave it up entirely, finding ways to include her son in what she did, teaching him early to respect and understand animals. Their little house on the ranch property felt like a true home, filled with love and laughter and the everyday chaos of family life. In the spring of 1883, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect, and 5-year-old Thomas was beside himself with excitement at the prospect of a sibling. He talked to Penelope's belly constantly, telling his unborn brother or sister about all the things they would do together, all the adventures they would have. Zachary watched these interactions with a full heart, amazed at how much their life had changed in just a few short years, how much joy had been packed into this small existence they had built. In August of 1883, a daughter arrived, quicker and easier than Thomas had been. They named her Sarah, after Penelope's mother, and she was quieter than her brother had been, more content to simply observe the world around her with serious, thoughtful eyes. Thomas adored her from the first moment, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to bath time, appointed himself her official protector and companion. The years flowed by like water over stones, smooth and steady. Thomas grew into a responsible young boy who shared his father's work ethic and his mother's gift with animals. Sarah developed a love of books and learning, her questions about the world around her endless and often surprisingly profound. Zachary and Penelope watched their children grow with pride and wonder, amazed that they had created these remarkable small people, grateful every day for the family they had built together. Their life was not without challenges. There were years when drought made ranching difficult, when money was tight and worry kept them awake at night. There were illnesses that struck the children, terrifying days when Penelope sat vigil by feverish bedsides and prayed to a God she had not always been sure was listening. There were moments of grief, too, when Richard Carson passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1887, leaving a hole in their lives that never quite healed. But through all of it, Zachary and Penelope held fast to each other, their love the anchor that kept them steady through every storm. Samuel Hartford died in 1890, leaving his ranch in equal parts to Zachary and his own son, who had been managing the business side of operations from Austin. It was more than Zachary had ever dreamed of, a real legacy to pass on to his children, proof that hard work and integrity could pay off in ways beyond simple survival. He and Penelope worked tirelessly to honor Hartford's memory and build on what he had started, expanding the operation carefully, training more hands in the humane treatment of animals, becoming known throughout Texas as people who did business with honor and treated everyone fairly. As the new century approached, Zachary found himself reflecting more and more on the strange path his life had taken. He had been a rootless drifter with no prospects and no hope, running from pain and loss, convinced he would never have anything worth staying for. Then a storm had driven him to seek shelter in a small stable, and he had heard a voice singing lullabies to frightened horses, and everything had changed. That voice had brought peace not just to the animals but to his own troubled soul, had shown him that love and home and family were not impossible dreams but real possibilities if he was brave enough to reach for them. On a warm spring evening in 1899, Zachary and Penelope sat on their porch watching the sunset, just as they had done thousands of times before. Their children were grown now, Thomas 21, and already helping run the ranch, Sarah 16, and preparing to attend a teacher's college in Austin, pursuing the dream her mother had once harbored for herself. The house was quieter than it had been in years, and while Zachary sometimes missed the chaos of young children, he also appreciated this new phase of life, the chance to simply be with his wife without constant demands on their attention. "You remember the night we met?" Penelope asked, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "Every detail," Zachary replied. "The storm, the frightened horses, your voice cutting through the chaos like light through darkness. I knew even then that you were special, that you were going to change my life." "I was so scared that night," Penelope admitted. "Not just of the storm or the horses, but of feeling anything for you. I had built walls around my heart after Mama died, convinced that letting anyone in would just mean more pain. But you somehow got past all those defenses without even trying." "Your voice brought peace everywhere," Zachary said, repeating the words he had spoken that first night. "That is still true, you know. After all these years, after everything we have been through, you still bring peace to my life every single day." Penelope leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart full to overflowing. "We built something good here, did we not? A good life, a good family, something worth holding on to." "We built something extraordinary," Zachary corrected. "And the best part is we are not done yet. We still have years ahead of us. Years to watch our children grow into their own lives. Years to maybe become grandparents. Years to simply love each other and be grateful for every day we get." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The horses in the nearby corral moved peacefully, their sounds a familiar soundtrack to their life. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear Sarah singing softly to herself as she worked on her schoolwork, her voice clear and pure, an echo of her mother's gift passed down to the next generation. Thomas appeared from the direction of the stables, dusty and tired from a long day's work, but smiling when he saw his parents on the porch. He climbed the steps and settled into a chair nearby, accepting the glass of water his mother poured for him from the pitcher she always kept ready. "Everything settled for the night?" Zachary asked. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied. "All the animals are fed and secure. I checked on that new mare, the one Mama has been working with. She is responding well, really coming out of her shell." "Your mother has a gift," Zachary said, the same pride in his voice that had been there 20 years earlier when he first watched her calm, frightened horses. "I keep telling her she should write down her techniques, put together some kind of manual so others could learn from her methods." "Maybe someday," Penelope said with a small smile. "Right now I am just happy doing the work and seeing the results. That is reward enough." Sarah emerged from the house carrying a lamp, announcing that dinner was ready whenever they wanted to eat. The family rose as one and moved inside, continuing their easy conversation over a simple meal of beef and vegetables and fresh bread. This was their life now, comfortable and familiar, filled with the rhythms of work and family and love, everything Zachary had dreamed of during those lonely years of drifting. After dinner, as Penelope cleaned up and the children attended to their evening tasks, Zachary stepped back out onto the porch. The night was cool and clear, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He thought about the frightened young man he had been, the person who believed he did not deserve happiness or love or a place to call home. He thought about the woman who had shown him he was wrong, who had seen past his rough exterior and recognized something worth loving underneath. Penelope joined him a few minutes later, slipping her hand into his. They stood together looking out over the land they had built a life on, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you have done something meaningful with the years you have been given. "I love you," Zachary said, the words as true and necessary as they had been the first time he spoke them. "I love you too," Penelope replied, her voice carrying that same quality that had first captivated him, that gift for bringing peace and comfort with nothing but the sound of her voice. Always and forever. In the years that followed, their love only deepened. Thomas married a kind young woman from town and gave them 3 grandchildren who filled their home with noise and laughter during frequent visits. Sarah completed her teaching degree and returned to El Paso to teach at the school, making a real difference in the lives of her students, just as her mother had once dreamed of doing. Zachary and Penelope watched it all with grateful hearts, their hands always finding each other, their love the constant thread that held everything together. When Zachary turned 50, he began to think seriously about retirement, about stepping back from the day-to-day management of the ranch and letting Thomas take full control. He wanted time to simply enjoy Penelope's company, to travel a little, to pursue hobbies he had never had time for during his working years. But more than anything, he wanted to make sure they took advantage of every moment they had left together, fully aware that time was precious and finite and should never be taken for granted. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1904 with a large gathering of family and friends, the party stretching late into the night with music and dancing and stories of their years together. Zachary stood up at one point and offered a toast, his voice thick with emotion as he thanked Penelope for choosing him, for building a life with him, for showing him what love really meant. 25 years ago, I was a lost soul, he said to the assembled crowd. I had no direction, no purpose, no hope for the future. Then a storm came, and I heard a voice singing in the darkness, and everything changed. That voice brought peace to frightened horses, but more importantly, it brought peace to my frightened heart. Penelope, you saved me in every way a person can be saved, and I will spend whatever time I have left showing you how grateful I am. There was not a dry eye in the room when he finished, Penelope least of all. She stood and embraced her husband, their children and grandchildren and friends applauding around them, celebrating a love that had proven itself over decades, that had weathered every challenge and emerged stronger for it. As they moved into their 60s, Zachary and Penelope finally did take that step back from the ranch, moving into a smaller house in El Paso proper, and letting Thomas and his family take over the property. It was bittersweet, leaving the place where they had raised their children and built their life, but it also felt right, like a natural progression into the next phase of their journey together. Retirement suited them. They spent their days reading, gardening, taking long walks through town and visiting with neighbors and friends. Penelope still worked with horses occasionally when someone had a particularly difficult animal, but mostly she focused on her grandchildren, teaching them songs and stories, passing down the wisdom she had accumulated over a lifetime. Zachary took up woodworking, creating beautiful pieces that he gave as gifts to family and friends, finding satisfaction in working with his hands in a new way. Their love remained the center of everything. After more than 30 years of marriage, they still reached for each other in the night, still sat close together whenever possible, still found joy in each other's company. They had arguments occasionally, as any long-married couple does, but they never let the sun set on their anger, always making peace before sleep, always remembering that their time together was too precious to waste on pride or stubbornness. In the spring of 1912, as Zachary approached his 65th birthday, he began to feel his age in ways he never had before. His joints ached, his energy flagged, simple tasks took longer than they once had. But when he mentioned this to Penelope, she simply smiled and took his hand and reminded him that they were growing old together, just as they had always planned, and there was a kind of beauty in that too. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their townhouse watching another sunset, Penelope began to sing. It was one of the lullabies she had sung that first night, the melody that had brought peace to frightened horses and captured the heart of a lonely cowboy. Her voice was older now, not quite as pure and strong as it had been at 19, but it carried with it the weight of a life well lived, of love given and received, of promises made and kept. Zachary listened with tears in his eyes, transported back to that stormy night more than 3 decades earlier, remembering the young woman who had changed everything, who had shown him what it meant to truly live rather than simply exist. He reached for her hand, lacing his weathered fingers through hers, and felt the same surge of love and gratitude he had felt every day since. "Your voice still brings peace everywhere," he said softly when she finished singing. "It brought peace to those horses. It brought peace to me. It brought peace to our children, and now to our grandchildren. You have spent your whole life giving that gift to others, Penelope, and I hope you know how much it has meant, how many lives you have touched." "Our life together has been my greatest gift," Penelope replied, squeezing his hand. "Everything else has just been extra blessing on top of the blessing I received the night you walked into our stable. You showed me that love was possible, that happiness was not just a memory from before the grief, that I could build something new and beautiful even after loss. You saved me just as surely as I saved you." They sat together as darkness fell, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had sustained them through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, ordinary moments and extraordinary ones. They had created a family, established a legacy, touched countless lives through their work and their example. But more than any of that, they had loved each other completely and without reservation, and in the end, that was the thing that mattered most. The stars appeared one by one in the vast Texas sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their courtship, their wedding, the births of their children, all the milestones of their shared life. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied softly, and Penelope smiled, remembering how it had all begun with frightened animals and a storm and a voice singing lullabies in the darkness. "You have any regrets?" Zachary asked suddenly, the question coming from a place of deep reflection rather than doubt. Penelope considered carefully before answering. "No," she said finally, "not a single one. Every choice I made, every path I took led me here to this moment with you." "How could I possibly regret anything about that?" "Me either," Zachary agreed. "If I could go back and live my life over, I would not change a thing. Well, maybe I would have worked up the courage to kiss you sooner," he added with a small laugh. Penelope laughed too, the sound still musical and warm despite the years. "You were worth waiting for," she said. "Every single moment of waiting was worth it to have this life with you." As the night deepened and the air grew cool, they finally rose and went inside, their movements slow but comfortable, bodies that knew each other as well as they knew themselves. They prepared for bed with the easy efficiency of long practice, changed into night clothes, washed faces and brushed teeth, moved through the small rituals that marked the end of every day. When they finally climbed into bed, they automatically moved into their familiar sleeping positions, Penelope's head on Zachary's shoulder, his arms wrapped around her, their legs tangled together. It was the way they had slept for more than 30 years, the way they would sleep for whatever years remained to them. "Thank you," Zachary whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Penelope asked, already half asleep. "For singing to those horses, for calming them with your voice, for letting me hear you, for giving me a chance, for loving me, for building this life with me, for everything." Penelope pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. "Thank you for listening, for seeing me, for choosing me, for staying, for loving me back, for giving me all of this." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, two souls so intertwined that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Outside, the Texas night settled over the land, peaceful and still, the world continuing its eternal turning. And in a small house in El Paso, two people who had found each other in a storm so many years ago slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had found exactly what they were meant to find, exactly who they were meant to be with, exactly where they were meant to be. Their story was not one of grand adventures or dramatic rescues, though it had begun with both. It was instead a story of quiet devotion, of choosing each other every single day, of building something lasting and true through patience and perseverance, and an absolute commitment to loving each other well. It was a story that would live on through their children and grandchildren, through the people and animals they had touched with their kindness and wisdom, through the example they had set of what love could be when two people were brave enough to open their hearts completely. And it all started with lullabies sung to frightened horses in the darkness of a storm, with a cowboy who listened and recognized that voice as the sound of home he had been searching for his entire life. Everything else, all the joy and love and family and legacy that followed, grew from that single moment of connection, that instant when two lonely souls recognized each other across the stable and decided to take a chance on happiness. Years later, when Thomas told his own children the story of how their grandparents met, he always emphasized that moment, that perfect storm that brought two people together who were meant to find each other. He told them about the frightened horses and the song that calmed them, about the cowboy who stood in the doorway and fell in love with a voice before he ever saw a face, about the courage it took to admit feelings and take risks and build a life together in an uncertain world. And when those children grew up and had children of their own, they passed the story down again, each generation adding their own details and memories, but always keeping the essential truth at the heart of it. That love has the power to transform everything, to take two broken pieces and make them whole, to create something beautiful and lasting from the raw materials of chance and courage and choice. The story of Zachary and Penelope became woven into the fabric of their family's history, a reminder that the best things in life often come from the most unexpected places, that being open to possibility can lead to miracles, that singing lullabies to frightened horses might just be the first step toward everything you have ever wanted. And somewhere in the vast sweep of time and space and human experience, their love remains, a testament to the power of connection, the importance of listening, the transformative nature of compassion, and the simple truth that sometimes, when we least expect it, we find exactly what we need in exactly the right moment, and everything changes, and life becomes not just bearable but beautiful, not just survivable but worth celebrating every single day. The end of their story was still years away when they sat on that porch in 1912, still decades of love and life and family to experience. But the foundation had been laid that stormy night in 1878, when a young woman sang to frightened horses, and a cowboy listened and recognized the voice of peace, of home, of love itself calling to him across the darkness. Everything that came after was simply the fulfillment of the promise made in that moment, the natural unfolding of a connection so deep and true that not even death itself would be able to break it completely. For love like theirs, built on mutual respect and admiration, on shared values and complementary strengths, on the daily choice to be kind and patient and understanding, does not simply end when one or both partners pass away. It lives on in the children who carry their genes and their values forward. It lives on in the stories told and retold. It lives on in the lives touched and changed by their example. It lives on in the very fabric of the world they helped shape through their work and their love and their absolute commitment to doing right by each other, and by everyone they encountered. And they did exactly that, proving that the simplest gesture, the kindest word, the bravest choice can change not just one life but many, can create ripples that spread outward in ever-widening circles, touching people and places and futures in ways both seen and unseen. Their love was their legacy, and it was more than enough. It was everything.